Okay, so for those of you who were here last week, you all made me a promise. Do you remember what that promise was? Okay. You were going to help me reclaim this idea and the word of calling. Okay. Now remember that? Okay. We talked about how much the church had stolen this idea of being called over the centuries, so that now if we say that someone is called, the first thought we have is them becoming a pastor or a nun or a monk. So being called or having a calling or having this other word that we talk about, vocation, is something that each one of us has. And we can learn a lot about this calling that we have through stories in Scripture. There are countless people in the Bible who show us about being called, but since we only have 5 weeks, we had to be really choosy about the stories that we would explore. So last week, we decided to start at the burning bush with who? Okay, you remembered something. Good. We heard how Moses was just minding his own business. He was keeping watch over his father-in-law's sheep when he caught a glimpse of this bush that had flames coming from it but was not consumed. And so he approached this bush, and what did he hear? Moses! Moses! He heard his name. Then, as it always seems to happen, he had a full-on conversation with God, where God told Moses everything that God wanted Moses to do, basically step by step. And we who were here last week celebrated the fact that God indeed tells us our plans in the same way, right? Plain as day, step by step, every move along the way, right? No, not at all. So actually we kind of lamented the fact that God does not often or ever speak that clearly anymore, or that we would hope. God does not lay out those plans for our life step by step in nearly the same way that Moses experienced it. Fortunately, there are ways that we can listen for God's voice and somehow discern God's call and our vocation in our lives. But it still seems as though we are limiting ourselves when we talk about calling. So I was happy to report that as I watched and listened to you speak recently, that you are indeed fulfilling this promise, even if you can't remember it, of reclaiming this word and this understanding of being called. I've heard you talk about it, and I think I see glimpses of it. But there's still more to it. Because often when we talk about those things to which we are called, it still seems as though they are just that, things. We talk about the things we do, our jobs, careers, and occupations, our positions, our titles. We talk more about that, and we talk much less about those things that we are. And that's why I think we need to hear Ruth's story tonight. In the midst of all of those transitions in their journey, we saw all the kids get mixed around there. In the midst of all that death and loss and the grief they were facing, Ruth remained loyal in who she was as a daughter-in-law to Naomi, and who she was as a friend and as someone who accompanied Naomi in a new place in all this loss. So as we hear in the beginning of the book of Ruth, we started with Naomi. She and her husbands and her 2 sons fled from Bethlehem, from their home country, because of that famine. And they ended up in the country of Moab. But then not long after they arrived, Naomi's husband died. And as a woman in those times, she had to be reliant on her sons. And then her sons, while living in this country of Moab, each got married to local women, Moabites. How's that for a term? But 10 years after that, both of those sons died as well. So suddenly there are these 3 women who are only left with each other, which again, in that day and age, does not bode well for 3 widowed women with no one to rely on. And so at that point, Naomi had heard that back in Bethlehem, the famine had ended. And she thought since she had nothing left in Moab, she would return. Then her 2 daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, were getting ready to go to Bethlehem with her, but Naomi said, "No, you stay with your parents and your family. Your work with me is done." It took some convincing from Naomi, but Orpah decided to stay back. But Ruth would not. Ruth told Naomi, as we heard, "Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, your God, my God." What Ruth was doing was a calling. Ruth felt called to stay with Naomi, accompanying her in her journey back to her home country, which of course was a foreign land to Ruth. We can't gloss over Orpah, though. I mean, the rest of the book kind of does, but she also followed a calling back to be with and care for her own parents and family and stay in Moab. We can't forget that. But they didn't name the book Orpah, so we're stuck with Ruth, which is good, because now the book follows her journey with Naomi into Bethlehem. It goes on to tell her story about how once they got to Bethlehem, she would go out and glean the fields. She would follow the harvesters and pick up the wheat and the barley that they had left behind to provide food for her and for Naomi. We heard how her reputation preceded her among the owners of the field who would watch her, particularly in a rich man named Boaz. It was a reputation of this foreign woman who would travel with her widowed mother-in-law, giving up her own life to care for someone else. I mean, that story we hear does not say anything about her hearing God telling her these things to do. She doesn't have a dream. She doesn't have a vision. She doesn't approach a burning bush like Moses did. Ruth simply felt compelled to do that on her own. It wasn't part of her being to do anything else. I mean, we heard Naomi tried to talk her out of it, but Ruth couldn't not go. And part of being called is simply having that inner voice, or that innate sense that each of us has, or that understanding of who you are and what you stand for as a person, to do the things that you do. That is a calling. That is our vocation. It's who you are called to be. Again, our calling is not just what we do, it's who we are. Sometimes that might mean picking up your entire life, leaving behind everything that's familiar that you've ever known, and doing that next thing in your life that just feels right. There's no external voice that can tell you that. There's no dream or vision that might direct you to that. You simply know in your being of beings that this certain path is the only thing you could do. Because that's how God made you. And I think one of the more amazing things about all of this is that Ruth was able to do this even in the midst of her grief. Her husband had just died. Her husband's brother just died. And she's standing with the mother who just lost 2 sons, who's also remembering her husband's death 10 years prior. I'm sure that most, if not all of us, know that that kind of grief can paralyze us. Grief can leave us in a complete fog, not knowing what to do, which creates that time more than ever when we need to reach deep within ourselves to know what the next step should be or could be. I mean, that just makes it sound easy, and I know it's not. which I think is why it becomes utterly important that they did it together, accompanying one another in their grief and accompanying one another in this entirely new journey. I mean, Ruth left behind family and friends, her homeland, her Gentile background, all in order to be who she's been called to be, trusting now in the God who carried Naomi in her life. Remember, we heard Ruth say, "Your God shall be my God." So even apart from those things that we do, and maybe especially apart from those things that we do, we still have this calling and vocation in God because of who we are. Amen.